You can look at a young man lying in bed at 2 in the afternoon and see two completely different things depending on the lens you are wearing. If you look through the lens of frustration, financial stress, and shattered expectations, you see a lazy, entitled brat who is refusing to launch. You see someone who is taking advantage of your hospitality, eating your food, burning your electricity, and giving absolutely nothing back to the family unit. But if you swap that lens out for a clinical one, if you strip away the anger and really look at the physiology and the spirit of the human being beneath the sheets, you might see something far more terrifying. You might see a person who isn't refusing to row the boat because they are enjoying the drift, but someone who has dropped the oars because their arms are simply too heavy to lift. That is the fundamental disconnect I saw the moment I picked up the file on the Miller family. When I first read the production notes, the narrative was painted in broad, angry strokes by the parents, Mark and Brenda. They wrote to the show because they were at the end of their rope. They used words like parasite, leech, and manipulator to describe their 24-year-old son, Jason. To hear them tell it, Jason was the poster child for a generation that had lost its way, a young man who had every opportunity handed to him on a silver platter, but chose to retreat into the dark comfort of his bedroom, surrounded by empty soda cans and the glowing blue light of a video game monitor. They wanted me to be the enforcer. They wanted me to bring the hammer down, to scream at this boy, to shame him into getting a job and moving out. They came to Hollywood looking for a drill sergeant, but what they didn't realize was that you cannot shame a person out of a chemical imbalance, and you certainly cannot scream someone back to life when they feel like they are already dead. I remember watching the home footage they sent in before the taping. It is always the most telling part of the process for me because the cameras don't lie, and in the heat of the moment, people forget they are recording. The video was shaky, filmed on a smartphone by Mark as he barged into Jason's room. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the midday sun. The room was a disaster zone of dirty laundry and stagnation. Mark was shouting, pulling the covers off a lump in the bed, demanding to know why the lawn hadn't been mowed. And then I saw Jason. He didn't yell back. He didn't fight. He didn't even cover his face. He just lay there. He looked at his father with eyes that were completely hollow, void of any spark, void of any fight. It wasn't the look of a defiant rebel. It was the look of a man who was watching his life happen to someone else from a great distance. I turned to my producers right then and said, "We are not dealing with a behavioral problem here. We are dealing with a survival problem." The central problem in this family was a massive gap in perception. Mark and Brenda are doers. Mark runs a construction business. He is a man who wakes up before the sun, works with his hands, and measures a man's worth by the sweat on his brow. Brenda is a real estate agent, high energy, always moving, always closing. In their world, if you aren't moving forward, you are moving backward. They view stillness as a moral failing. They view sadness as a weakness that you just need to shake off. So when they looked at Jason, they didn't see depression. They saw a personal insult. They interpreted his inability to get out of bed as a direct lack of respect for them and everything they had worked for. They thought he was doing this to them, not that this was happening within him, and that is a dangerous place to be. Because when you attribute malice to what is actually illness, you stop parenting and you start warring. I walked into the green room to meet Mark and Brenda first. I wanted to get a read on their energy before I brought Jason into the mix. The tension in that small room was palpable. You could feel the heat coming off of them. Mark was pacing, his jaw set tight. Brenda was sitting on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands, oscillating between tears and rage. They started in on me immediately, reciting the list of Jason's crimes. He failed 2 college classes 3 years ago. He quit his job at the warehouse after 3 weeks. He sleeps until 1. He stays up until 4. They were keeping score. They had a ledger in their heads of every dollar spent and every hour wasted. Mark looked me in the eye and said, "Doctor, Phil, I'm done. If he doesn't change today, I'm changing the locks when we get home. I can't watch a grown man rot in my house anymore." I listened. I let them vent. It's important to let people empty their emotional gun before you try to reason with them. But while they were talking about keys and jobs and chores, I was thinking about the neurochemistry of a 24-year-old brain that has shut down. I was thinking about the crushing weight of expectation. I asked them a simple question. When was the last time you saw your son smile? I don't mean a smirk. I mean a genuine, light-up-the-eyes smile. The room went silent. Mark stopped pacing. Brenda looked down at her lap. They couldn't answer. They couldn't remember. That silence told me everything. It told me that the relationship had become entirely transactional. It was no longer father and son or mother and son. It was landlord and delinquent tenant. They were so focused on the output, the job, the money, the chores, that they had completely lost sight of the machine that produces the output. The machine was broken. This is what I call a contaminated relationship. Every interaction between Jason and his parents had become toxic. There was no neutral ground. If Jason walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water, Mark would roll his eyes or make a snide comment about the vampire coming out of his cave. If Jason tried to speak, Brenda would interrupt with a lecture about potential. They were caught in a negative feedback loop. The more they pushed and criticized, the deeper Jason retreated into his shell to protect himself. The deeper he retreated, the more lazy he appeared, which caused them to push harder. It is a cycle of destruction that ends in one of two ways: total estrangement or tragedy. I was there to make sure it didn't end in tragedy. But to do that, I had to understand the history. People don't just wake up one day and decide to stop participating in life. Depression is insidious. It creeps in. It starts as a whisper and becomes a scream. I needed to know who Jason was before the lights went out. I needed to find the inflection point. So as the stage lights came up and the audience settled in, I prepared to peel back the layers of this family's history, not to assign blame because blame is just a waste of time, but to find the root cause. I needed to know if Jason was born with a predisposition to this darkness, or if life had knocked him down so hard he forgot how to stand up. And I needed to know if Mark and Brenda were willing to accept that their tough love might actually be the very thing keeping their son paralyzed. I walked onto the stage and took my seat, the studio lights bearing down on us, creating that familiar, high-pressure environment where the truth has a way of rising to the surface whether you want it to or not. Mark and Brenda were seated to my right, stiff as boards. Mark sat with his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture that screamed he was closed off to any opinion that didn't align with his own. Brenda was clutching a tissue, her leg bouncing nervously. I started the show by letting them paint the picture for the audience, and they did exactly what I expected them to do. They laid out the prosecution's case against their son. Mark told the audience about the car they bought Jason that just sits in the driveway gathering dust. He talked about the tuition checks he wrote for a degree that was never finished. He spoke about the sheer physical offense of coming home after a 12-hour shift of manual labor to find his able-bodied son asleep on the couch with a bag of chips on his chest. You could hear the murmurs in the audience. People were nodding. They were siding with the parents because on paper, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like entitlement run amok. But then I started digging. I asked them to tell me about Jason before the laziness set in. I wanted to know about the boy, not the problem. And this is where the narrative started to crack. Mark softened just for a second. and told me that in high school, Jason was a different species entirely. He was a varsity swimmer, he was on the honor roll, he had friends, a girlfriend, a life. He was by all accounts a golden boy. Mark puffed up a bit when he talked about Jason's swim meets, about how disciplined he used to be. He would be in the pool at 5 in the morning, Mark said, shaking his head in confusion. That's what I don't get, Dr. Phil. I know he has the drive. I've seen it. He just decided to turn it off. People don't just turn off their personality like a light switch, Mark, I told him. You don't go from being a varsity athlete with a 4 gigapascals to a recluse unless something catastrophic happens to your internal wiring. I needed to find out what that catastrophe was. As we peeled back the layers of the past 5 years, a pattern emerged that neither parent had recognized. It started in his freshman year of college. Jason had gone away to a rigorous university, carrying the heavy burden of his father's expectations. He was studying engineering, a major Mark had strongly suggested because it was practical, because it led to real jobs, but Jason struggled. He failed a key calculus class. For a kid who had never failed at anything, whose entire identity was built on being the achiever, that F wasn't just a grade, it was an identity crisis. He didn't tell his parents. He was too ashamed. He tried to double down, tried to work harder, but the anxiety started to eat him alive. He stopped sleeping, he stopped going to class, and eventually he crashed. When he moved back home, Mark and Brenda didn't see a wounded animal, they saw a quitter. They treated his return not as a convalescence, but as a temporary pit stop that had gone on too long. That was the seed of the escalation. I turned my attention to the monitors to bring Jason out. I wanted the audience to see him before he said a word. When Jason walked onto the stage, the air left the room. He walked with a shuffle, his shoulders hunched so far forward they were practically touching his ears. He was wearing a hoodie that was 2 sizes too big, like he was trying to disappear inside of it. His skin was pale, pasty, the kind of pallor you only get from avoiding the sun for months on end. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at his parents. He sat down in the chair next to me and stared at his shoes. Jason, I said softly, leaning in, thank you for being here. He barely nodded. I asked him, I've been listening to your folks talk about you for the last 20 minutes. They say you're lazy. They say you're mooching off them. They say you don't care. How does it feel to hear your father describe you that way? Jason looked up, and for the first time, I saw the depth of the pain in his eyes. They were red, rimmed, and exhausted. It feels like he's talking about a stranger, Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. He thinks I'm having fun. He thinks I enjoy lying in bed staring at the ceiling for 8 hours. He thinks it's a vacation. He doesn't know that it's torture. It's like my brain is on fire and frozen at the same time. I looked over at Mark. He was rolling his eyes. He wasn't buying it. To Mark, feelings were facts only when they were convenient. Oh, stop it, Jason, Mark snapped, interrupting the moment. You're not in torture. You're in a climate-controlled bedroom with free Wi-Fi. You want to know what torture is? Try roofing a house in July. That's torture. You're just making excuses. This was the dynamic. This was the escalation in real time. Every time Jason tried to express the internal reality of his condition, Mark crushed it with external logic. Mark was bringing a hammer to a biochemistry exam. I stopped Mark right there. Mark, you are arguing logic with emotion, I said firmly. You are judging his insides by your outsides. You think because he isn't bleeding, he isn't hurt. But let me tell you, I've worked with people in this chair for decades, and what I am looking at right now is not a young man who is relaxed. I am looking at a young man who is exhausted from fighting a war inside his own head that you refuse to acknowledge is even happening. I turned back to Jason. Tell me about the noise in your head, Jason. What does the inner dialogue say to you when your dad is banging on your door at noon? Jason took a breath and his hands were shaking. It tells me that he's right, Jason said, and that broke my heart. It tells me that I'm worthless. It tells me that I'm a burden. So I stay in bed, because if I go out there, I'm just going to disappoint him again. It's safer to be invisible. If I stay in my room, I can't mess anything up. This was the vicious cycle of their escalation. The parents' pressure created anxiety. The anxiety paralyzed Jason. The paralysis looked like laziness to the parents. The parents increased the pressure. It was a feedback loop from hell. I learned that just a week before the taping, things had reached a boiling point. Mark had physically removed the door to Jason's bedroom. He took the hinges off. He said he was removing the barrier, but what he actually did was strip away the last shred of privacy and safety Jason felt he had. Jason reacted not with anger, but with total shutdown. He stopped eating, he stopped speaking, he essentially went catatonic for 2 days until Brenda, out of fear, called the show. "You took the door off the hinges, Mark?" I asked, letting the absurdity of that action hang in the air. "You thought that by removing his privacy, you were going to inspire him to go get a job interview?" "I wanted him to know he can't hide from reality," Mark defended, though he looked a little less sure of himself now. "I wanted him to see us living our lives, to see what he's missing." "You didn't show him reality," I corrected him. "You showed him that he has no sanctuary. You showed him that his boundaries don't matter. And when you treat a human being like an object that you can just modify and manage without their consent, you don't get compliance. You get resistance. And in Jason's case, his resistance is silence. His resistance is doing absolutely nothing because it's the only control he has left." The tragedy of the situation was becoming clear. Mark and Brenda loved their son. I truly believe that. They were terrified for him, but their fear was manifesting as aggression. They were trying to scare him straight, unaware that he was already living in a state of constant terror. They were trying to ignite a fire under him, but you can't light a fire in a vacuum. Jason had no oxygen. He was suffocating under the weight of his own depression and the crushing expectations of a father who couldn't understand why his son couldn't just man up. We were standing at the edge of a precipice. If Mark didn't change his approach, Jason wasn't going to launch. He was going to self-destruct. And Mark would be left holding the hinges of a door to a room that was empty forever. I looked at Mark, who was still stewing in his chair, his arms crossed so tight across his chest, I thought he might cut off his own circulation. He was vibrating with that specific kind of righteous indignation that parents get when they feel they've done everything right and the result is still wrong. He was waiting for me to validate him. He was waiting for me to turn to Jason and say, "Get your act together, son." But that isn't how this works. You don't fix a complex problem with a bumper sticker slogan. I had to dismantle Mark's entire operating system regarding his son before we could even begin to rebuild. "Mark," I said, leaning forward and locking eyes with him, "I want to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with me. You've been yelling at this boy for 2 years. You've taken his door. You've cut off his money. You've shamed him. You've threatened him. So here is the million-dollar question. How is that working for you?" Mark blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Look at the results," I said, gesturing to Jason, who was currently staring at the floor, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the carpet. "Has your yelling made him get a job? Has taking the door off the hinges made him more ambitious? Has shaming him made him jump out of bed with a zest for life?" Mark hesitated. The logic trap was closing. "No," he admitted grudgingly. "But I can't just do nothing. I can't just let him rot." "But you aren't doing nothing, Mark. You are doing something very specific. You are pouring gasoline on a fire and wondering why it won't go out, I told him. You are trying to legislate behavior without understanding the motivation. You think this is an attitude problem? I'm telling you, this is a biochemistry problem compounded by a relational disaster. You are trying to use a hammer to fix a computer virus, and all you're doing is smashing the screen. I turned to Brenda. She had been quiet, playing the role of the suffering peacemaker. But in a family dynamic like this, the peacemaker is often just as dangerous as the aggressor because they maintain the status quo. Brenda, you're the buffer, I said. Mark attacks, Jason retreats, and you run back and forth between the two of them carrying messages and trays of food. You're keeping Jason comfortable in his dysfunction. You're slipping him $20 here, bringing him dinner there, softening Mark's blows. You think you're protecting him, but you're actually robbing him of the necessity to face reality on his own terms. You're loving him to death. Brenda started to cry. I just don't want them to kill each other, she sobbed. I'm scared that if I don't intervene, Mark will kick him out and Jason will. He won't make it on the street. He's fragile. He is fragile, I agreed, but he is also 24 years old. And right now, he has no reason to get strong because you two are carrying the entire weight of his life for him. One of you's carrying it with anger, and the other's carrying it with anxiety. But neither of you is letting him carry it himself. I swiveled my chair to face Jason. It was time to stop handling him with kid gloves. Empathy is crucial, but empathy without accountability is just enablement. I needed to challenge him. I needed to see if there was any fight left in the dog. Jason, I said, dropping my voice to that serious low register, I'm going to be hard on your parents, but don't think you're getting a free pass here. I look at you and I see a young man who has checked out. You've decided that life is too hard, so you've resigned from the human race. You're hiding in that room, not just because you're depressed, but because it's safe. It's a womb. As long as you stay in there, you don't have to fail. You don't have to be judged by the world. You only have to deal with your dad, and you've already figured out how to tune him out. Jason looked up, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Defensiveness. Good. I wanted a reaction. I'm not hiding, Jason muttered. I'm just stuck. I try to get up. I swear. I set alarms. I have lists of things I want to do. But when I wake up, it feels like there's a 1,000-pound weight on my chest. It's physical, Dr. Phil. It's not just I don't want to, it's I can't. I believe you, I said. I believe the weight is real. I believe the depression is a monster. But I also know this. You are participating in your own demise. You are cooperating with the disease. When you lie in that bed for 14 hours, you are feeding the depression. When you ignore your hygiene, you are feeding the depression. You are waiting to feel better before you do better. And I am here to tell you that is a weight you will never win. You have to act your way into a new way of feeling, not feel your way into a new way of acting. I pulled out a piece of paper from my folder. It was a printout of his daily schedule, or lack thereof, that he had filled out for the producers. Look at this, I said, holding it up. Wake up, 1 p.m. Video games, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Dinner, TV, internet. Sleep at 4 a.m. Jason, this isn't a life. This is a slow suicide. You are killing time until time kills you. And you are angry at your father for pointing it out, but deep down you know he's right about one thing. This is unsustainable. Jason's face crumpled. The mask of apathy slipped. I know it's unsustainable, he shouted, his voice cracking. Do you think I want to be this way? Do you think I want to be a loser living in my parents' house? I hate myself more than my dad hates me. Every time he looks at me with that disgust, I agree with him. I'm disgusted too. The audience went dead silent. Mark stopped rolling his eyes. He froze. He had never heard his son say that. He had assumed Jason didn't care. He assumed Jason was smugly enjoying the free ride. Hearing Jason scream that he hated himself, that he agreed with, the disgust struck a nerve that Mark didn't know he had. I seized that moment. Mark, I said softly, did you hear that? You've been attacking him because you think he's arrogant, you think he's entitled, but he's not. He's ashamed. He is drowning in shame. And every time you yell, you are just pushing his head further underwater. Mark looked at Jason, really looked at him for the first time since they sat down. The anger in Mark's face began to fracture, revealing the fear underneath. Mark's voice wavered. I just want him to be okay. I worked so hard to give him a head start. I grew up with nothing. I had to scratch and claw for everything, and I see him throwing it away, and it scares me to death. If I die tomorrow, what happens to him? Who takes care of him? I'm not yelling because I hate him. I'm yelling because I'm terrified. There it is, I said, pointing a finger at Mark. That is the truth. You aren't angry, you're terrified. You are a father who loves his son so much that the thought of him failing in this world is unbearable to you. But Mark, you cannot scare him into success. You are projecting your fear onto him, and it's crushing him. You have to stop parenting out of fear and start parenting out of strategy. I turned back to Jason. And you, Jason, you have to stop using your father's anger as an excuse to stay paralyzed. You've been playing the victim card. Oh, my dad is so mean, I can't function. Well, guess what? The world is mean. Life is hard. If you're waiting for your dad to become Mr. Rogers before you get a job, you're going to be waiting a long time. You have to decide right here and now if you are willing to fight for your own life, regardless of what your parents do. This was the confrontation. We stripped away the surface level complaints about chores and laziness and exposed the raw nerves underneath. A father paralyzed by fear of his son's failure, a mother paralyzed by the conflict, and a son paralyzed by shame and biology. The air in the room was heavy, charged with the energy of a family that had finally stopped shouting and started feeling. We had broken the stalemate. The lazy label had been ripped off, revealing the wounded human underneath. Now, the question was whether we could put the pieces back together in a way that actually worked, or if they would retreat back to their corners the moment the cameras stopped rolling. We were at the turning point. The studio was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself has mass. Mark was looking at his hands, Brenda was wiping her eyes, and Jason was staring at me, breathing hard like he had just run a sprint. We had cracked the shell. We had exposed the raw, beating heart of the dysfunction. But exposing the wound isn't the same as healing it. You can't just leave a family like this with their guts spilled out on the floor and say, good luck. You have to give them a roadmap. You have to give them a way out of the maze they've built for themselves. Jason, I said, my voice steady and calm, grounding the energy in the room. You said you feel like you have a 1,000-pound weight on your chest. You said your brain is on fire. I believe you. I know that feeling. It's called clinical depression, and it is a liar. It tells you that you are alone, that you are worthless, and that nothing will ever change. But here is the good news. We know how to treat this. We know how to put the fire out. I leaned in closer. But here is the catch. I can get you the best doctors in the world. I can get you the medication that will rebalance your chemistry. I can get you the therapy that will give you the tools to fight that negative inner voice. But I cannot do the work for you. I can give you the oars, but you have to row. Are you willing to row, Jason? Are you willing to fight for the life you say you want? Jason looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the hesitation. The comfort of the cave is addictive. But then he looked at his father, who was watching him with that terrified vulnerability we had just uncovered. Jason nodded. Yes, he said, I want to. I just don't know how. That's okay, I told him. You don't need to know how. That's my job. I'm going to send you to the PNP Center in Texas. These are the best neuroscientists in the country. They are going to map your brain. They are going to look at your hormones, your thyroid, your sleep patterns. We are going to find out exactly what is misfiring in your engine, and we are going to fix it. This isn't about willpower anymore. This is about biology. I turned to Mark and Brenda. And for you two, I said, my tone shifting to firm instruction. Your job is about to change completely. Mark, you are fired as the drill sergeant. You are done. No more yelling, no more door removing, no more shaming. From this moment on, you are not his boss. You are his father. Your only job is to love him and support his recovery. You cannot fix him. You have proven that. You have to step back and let the professionals do their job. Mark nodded slowly. It was a hard pill to swallow for a man used to fixing everything with his own two hands, but he knew I was right. I'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I just want my son back. And Brenda, I continued. You are fired as the buffer. No more secret money. No more shielding him from the consequences of his actions. When Jason comes back from treatment, he is going to need to stand on his own 2 feet. If you keep carrying him, his legs will never get strong. You have to love him enough to let him struggle a little bit. Struggle is how we grow. This was the plan. It wasn't just about fixing Jason. It was about restructuring the entire family system. We were moving from a dynamic of conflict and enablement to a dynamic of treatment and autonomy. I sent Jason off to treatment that very afternoon. The cameras followed him to the airport. He looked terrified, clutching his small bag like a lifeline. But he got on the plane. That was the first victory. 6 months later, I sat in my office reviewing the follow-up tapes. This is the part of the job that people don't see, the waiting, the hoping. You send people off with the best resources money can buy, but you never know if it's going to stick. Recovery is messy. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I popped the tape in, anxious to see what lens I would need this time. The video started. It wasn't Mark filming this time. It was a professional crew we sent to their home. The first shot was of the kitchen. Sunlight was streaming in, the table was set. And there, sitting at the table, eating breakfast with his parents, was Jason. He looked different physically. He had gained a little weight, but in a healthy way. His skin had color, but the biggest difference was in his posture. He was sitting up straight. He was engaging. The camera cut to an interview with Jason. He was sitting on the back porch, looking out at the yard. It wasn't magic, Jason said to the camera. It was hard. The first month at the center was the hardest thing I've ever done. My brain fought me every step of the way. But once the meds kicked in, and once I started really doing the therapy, the fog started to lift. I realized that my depression wasn't me. It was just something I had. And I realized that my dad wasn't attacking me because he hated me. He was just scared. That changed everything. The tape cut to Mark. He looked 10 years younger. The tension that had been permanently etched into his forehead was gone. I had to learn to shut my mouth, Mark laughed. A genuine, hearty laugh. That was the hardest part. When he came home, I wanted to ask him every day, did you apply for a job? Did you do this? Did you do that? But doctor, Phil's voice was in my head saying, you're fired, Mark. So I just asked him, how are you feeling today? And you know what? He started telling me, we actually talk now about real stuff, not just about the lawn. Jason had gotten a part-time job. It wasn't the high-powered engineering career Mark had originally envisioned. He was working at a local garden center, moving plants, working with his hands, being outside. It was low stress, physical, and grounding. And for now, it was exactly what he needed. He was paying a small amount of rent to his parents, a symbolic gesture of his autonomy. He was rowing his own boat. It was a small boat, and he was rowing slowly, but he was moving. I watched the final scene of the tape. It was the three of them, Mark, Brenda, and Jason, working in the garden together. Mark was showing Jason how to prune a rose bush. Jason was listening, nodding, and then he made a joke. I couldn't hear what it was, but Mark threw his head back and laughed. Brenda smiled, watching them. That was the breakthrough. It wasn't that Jason was suddenly a CEO. It wasn't that he was cured forever. Depression is a chronic condition that requires management. The breakthrough was that the relationship was no longer contaminated, the toxicity was gone, they were a family again. I leaned back in my chair, feeling that familiar sense of relief and satisfaction. This is why we do it. We don't do it for the ratings. We don't do it for the spectacle. We do it for that moment when a father and son can stand in a garden and laugh together because they aren't enemies anymore. We do it to prove that even when the light seems like it has gone out forever, there is always a way to find the switch. Jason's story isn't a fairy tale. He still has bad days. Mark still has moments of frustration. Brenda still worries. That's reality. But they have the tools now. They have a new lens. They aren't looking at a lazy brat and tyrannical parents anymore. They are looking at three flawed, complex human beings who love each other enough to change. And in the end, that is the only outcome that matters. I turned off the monitor and sat in the quiet of my office for a moment. The silence there is different from the silence in the studio. It's reflective, not expectant. I thought about the journey the Miller family had taken from that dark, airless room with the missing door to the sunlight of their garden. It's easy to look at a story like theirs and think, well, they got the happy ending. But in my line of work, you learn quickly that there are no endings, really. There are only new chapters. And the chapter Jason is writing now is perhaps the most important one because it's the one where the real work begins. The show is over. The applause has faded. The cameras are gone. Now, it's just Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. That is where life is actually lived in the mundane, untelevised grind of consistency. I thought about the thousands of other families watching at home who saw themselves in Mark and Jason. The fathers who can't understand why their sons won't just get up. The sons who feel paralyzed by a weight they can't explain. The mothers who are exhausted from playing referee. If there is one takeaway from this entire ordeal, one piece of truth that I want to resonate beyond the screen, it is this. Behavior is a language. When someone stops functioning, when they retreat from the world, they are screaming at the top of their lungs in a language that has no words. They are telling you that their system has failed. And if you respond to that failure with judgment, you are only ensuring that the failure becomes permanent. Jason's laziness was never about a lack of work ethic. It was a defense mechanism. It was a shield against a world that felt too sharp to touch. And Mark's anger was never about hatred. It was a shield against the terrifying possibility that he couldn't protect his child. Once they both put down their shields, Once they stopped fighting the symptoms and started treating the cause, the healing could finally begin. It's a lesson in the power of the autopsy, not of a body, but of a dynamic. We had to cut it open, look at the ugly parts, and understand the pathology before we could stitch it back together. I picked up the file one last time to sign off on the case. I looked at the photo of Jason from the beginning, pale, hollow, disappearing. And I thought about the young man I just saw on the screen, working, laughing, participating. He isn't fixed in the sense that he will never struggle again. He will likely have to manage his depression for the rest of his life. He will have days where the bed feels like a magnet. He will have moments of doubt. But the difference now is that he isn't fighting alone in the dark. He has a team, he has a strategy, and most importantly, he has his dignity back. We often talk about saving people on this show, but the truth is, I didn't save Jason. Mark didn't save Jason. Jason saved himself. He made the choice to get on that plane. He made the choice to take the meds. He made the choice to get out of bed every morning, even when it hurt. All we did was turn on the lights so he could see where the door was. That's all any of us can do for each other, illuminate the path, and hope the person we love has the courage to walk it. As I closed the file and placed it on the stack, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the success, but for the resilience of the human spirit. It takes a hell of a lot of courage to admit you're broken on national television. It takes even more courage to change. The Millers did both. They walked through the fire and came out the other side, not unscarred, but unburdened. And that, in my book, is a victory worth celebrating. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to figure out how to be human together, how to love each other through the mess, and how to keep moving forward, one imperfect step at a time.